ready to shake up your mindset. In the next hour, you'll discover 10 paradoxes that defy logic and can transform the way you think. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and let yourself go. Each paradox will jolt you with an apparent contradiction, yet one that holds a revealing insight: the liar's paradox. It all begins with a seemingly simple statement. This sentence is false. At first glance, one might assume it's just a trivial riddle, but pausing to analyze it reveals a genuine, logical maze. If you decide that this statement is true, then what it declares, that it is false, must also be correct, creating a contradiction. Conversely, if you classify it from the start as false, you end up admitting that what it says is actually true, thus making it true. In both scenarios, you're caught in a loop with no way out, where neither true nor false behaves as we normally expect. The earliest anecdote about this paradox takes us back to classical Greece, where a version of it is attributed to Epimenides. Nonetheless, it resurfaced in various forms throughout history whenever philosophers and logicians stopped to reflect on the logic of language and the nature of self-reference. Even in the Middle Ages, thinkers like St. Augustine encountered this dilemma while discussing the importance of truth in Scripture and in theological speculation. They realized that a single short sentence, by turning on itself, could undermine the clear distinction between truth and falsehood that had once seemed so unquestionable. Logic took a significant leap forward in the 19th century when mathematicians such as Georg Cantor and Gottlob Frege began to formalize the foundations of mathematical reasoning and language. However, during the 20th century, this paradox and others like it gained particular prominence with figures such as Bertrand Russell. In his quest to build a contradiction-free mathematics, Russell noticed that self-referential statements like "this sentence is false" appeared to crack open any logical framework that didn't impose restrictions on how objects or propositions could be defined. Russell proposed his theory of types to prevent a class from belonging to itself or a set from containing itself as a member, hoping to evade such contradictions. While his work proved crucial, there was still plenty left to explore. Later on, the Polish logician and mathematician Alfred Tarski advocated for a distinction between object language and meta-language in order to untangle the knots that arise when we try to describe the truth of a statement in the very same language that the statement uses. According to Tarski, you cannot discuss the truth of a sentence within the same system in which it is formulated, precisely because that leads to paradoxes like the liar's. When Kurt Gödel introduced his incompleteness theorems, he showed that any formal system robust enough to describe arithmetic would inevitably include statements that can't be clearly classified as true or false within that system itself. Although he wasn't referring directly to the liar's paradox, the spirit of his discovery resonated with the idea that there are inherent limits to our ability to categorize every statement possible. In a sense, the liar's paradox was a precursor, illustrating how fragile a logical edifice can be if we don't handle self-referential statements with care. What's most striking is that this issue isn't limited to philosophy or mathematics alone. When you look closely at the power of self-reference in language, you find an infinitely reflecting mirror with no clear boundary between what is real and what is merely an image. This sentence is false functions almost like a spell that, through its own brevity, exposes the vulnerability of our mental categories. We're used to labeling any claim as either true or false, but this statement mocks that habit and points us toward a third path, the impossibility of fitting it into our usual logical frameworks. Over the centuries, many have viewed this paradox as a symbol of the inherent complexity in human intelligence. Perhaps our certainties are less solid than we believe, and what we consider common sense is more fragile than it appears. The true power of this paradox lies in how it nudges us to question what we think we know. It urges us to wonder whether, in some cases, it's the language itself that leads us into the abyss of contradiction. Ultimately, the liar's paradox serves as a reminder that the reality we believe we understand may be peppered with dark corners where the rules break down and definitions clash with their own limits. Embracing this uncertainty doesn't weaken us. Rather, it inspires us to keep the flame of investigation and reflection alive, a driving force that continues to fuel both philosophical reasoning and scientific progress to this day. Achilles and the tortoise, Zeno's paradox. One of the most famous paradoxes attributed to Zeno of Elea is the story involving Achilles and a tortoise, describing a situation in which Achilles, the swiftest runner in Greek mythology, can never manage to catch the tortoise despite its much slower pace. Let's imagine the starting point. Achilles grants the tortoise a head start. By the time Achilles begins to run, the tortoise is already some distance ahead. The core of the paradox emerges when you analyze the motion in increasingly smaller segments. First, Achilles must reach the spot where the tortoise began. By the time he gets there, the tortoise has already moved a bit further. Next, Achilles must cover that new distance, but by the moment he arrives, the tortoise has advanced once again. On and on it goes, such that Achilles never appears to definitively close the gap. Taken to its logical extreme, this premise seems to suggest that a faster runner cannot overtake a slower one if the slower runner had even the slightest advantage. Naturally, everyday experience shows otherwise. In reality, a quick sprinter easily overtakes a tortoise. Yet Zeno's aim was not to deny the possibility of catching up, but rather to illuminate a contradiction involving the concept of motion and the notion of infinity in ancient mathematics. It's important to remember that Zeno lived in ancient Greece, long before the formalization of infinitesimal numbers or infinite summations of distance. Dividing space and time into infinitely many small increments was at the time a baffling proposition. Achilles and the tortoise highlights the difficulty of understanding how an infinite series of intervals can result in a finite distance completed within a finite duration. Over the centuries, mathematicians such as Eudoxus and Archimedes offered early reflections on how to manage infinite series. However, it was during the 17th and 18th centuries, with the emergence of infinitesimal calculus by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, that a definitive solution to Zeno's puzzle surfaced. In modern terms, when we sum the decreasing distances Achilles travels while pursuing the tortoise, we arrive at a finite value, confirming that Achilles will, in fact, catch the tortoise within a specific amount of time. Essentially, the paradox hinges on the idea of covering an infinite number of sub-distances to reach the tortoise, which at first glance seems impossible. But each sub-distance or time interval is successively smaller, so the total sum doesn't expand indefinitely. Modern arithmetic and geometry show that although the steps involved are infinite in number, their combined length can indeed be finite. What's most fascinating is not just the practical question of who wins, but the way Zeno challenges our intuition about motion. By breaking movement down into infinitely many subdivisions, he shows how our standard notions of space and time can clash with the concept of infinity. Today, armed with the tools of calculus, we see that velocity and the sum of partial distances can fit together coherently, ultimately confirming that Achilles, with his superior speed, will definitely overtake the tortoise. Still, the power of this paradox lies in the reminder that behind something as seemingly straightforward as running and catching up, there's a profound philosophical and mathematical issue at play. Zeno's clever example exposes the limitations of a purely linear perspective on space and time, prompting us to question the nature of movement itself. Even in the present day, the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise underscores the significance of rigorously defining concepts such as infinity, velocity, and continuity, proof that what appears obvious to our senses isn't always so simple when subjected to strict logical or mathematical scrutiny. The arrow paradox, Zeno. Among the various paradoxes attributed to Zeno of Elea, the one known as the arrow paradox offers a profound reflection on the nature of motion and the passage of time. At first glance, it might seem that this puzzle doesn't involve much complexity. An arrow shot by an archer moves from one point to another, something anyone can observe. However, Zeno's formulation seeks to demonstrate precisely the opposite. If we analyze it in a certain way, that arrow isn't moving at all. The core of this paradox goes like this. Imagine an arrow in flight. According to Zeno, if we divide time into a series of indivisible instants, like frames of reality that are each entirely static, then in each instant, the arrow occupies a specific space that coincides with its own length. In other words, during each infinitesimal instant, the arrow is at rest because there's no possibility of movement in an interval of zero duration. If, in every instant, the arrow is motionless, how can it be said to move overall? At first, this clashes with our everyday experience, where we clearly see the arrow soaring through the air, eventually hitting a target or falling to the ground. Yet Zeno's point is to question our assumptions about continuity and the divisibility of time. In ancient Greek thought, the idea of dividing time into infinitesimal parts, or atoms of time, had no solid mathematical basis like it does today. The arrow paradox, therefore, challenged the notion that motion is naturally self-evident, showing that if you break it down into infinitely many fragments, an apparent contradiction emerges. Over the centuries, many thinkers have interpreted this paradox in various ways. Some argue that Zeno confuses the concept of an instant with that of a duration. Strictly speaking, an instant has no temporal extension. It doesn't have a before or an after, so it's misleading to expect proof of movement within such an indivisible fragment of time. Instead, motion becomes evident over intervals, however brief they may be, rather than in those isolated instants. Modern philosophy and mathematics address this paradox through the lens of infinitesimal analysis. In the framework of calculus, time is viewed as something continuous and divisible into infinitely many fractions, each with a measurable, albeit very small, length. Motion is then the sum of all these minute changes in position during these tiny time intervals, which add up to a genuine displacement. Zeno's approach of insisting upon observable movement in frozen snapshots of time overlooks the fact that motion is defined across an interval, however small, rather than in the mathematical void of a durationless instant. It's worth noting that, beyond questioning the nature of motion, Zeno sought to support the view of his teacher Parmenides, who argued that true reality was devoid of change or multiplicity. If we rely exclusively on strict logic, nothing ought to move or be transformed. These paradoxes were a way to highlight the inconsistencies in the common-sense perception of the era, showing that rigorous reasoning could lead to seemingly absurd conclusions. Although today we might assume that scientific discoveries and the development of calculus solve this paradox, Zeno's cleverness continues to prompt us to reflect on the continuity of time and how movement happens. Could future technology possibly detect those absolute moments of stillness if time truly consisted of discrete units, or is time a continuous flow in which the arrow is never really at rest at any specific point? The arrow paradox remains a valuable intellectual exercise, reminding us that even the most familiar phenomena, such as seeing an object soar through the air, can become perplexing and inexplicable when analyzed in depth. Ultimately, this philosophical tale illustrates that even the most obvious facts, an arrow in flight, can conceal unexpected complexities. Common sense can be rattled when we probe the fundamental structure of reality. Thus, the arrow paradox, born more than 2,000 years ago, still resonates in the history of thought, reminding us that motion, space and time, far from being obvious givens, warrant our continuous attention and scrutiny. The arrow does move, yet at the same time, if we listen to Zeno, it doesn't move at any specific instant, underscoring the paradoxical and awe-inspiring nature of our understanding of the world. The Barber paradox. In the early years of the 20th century, British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell set out to examine in depth the foundations of mathematics. Among his key concerns was avoiding contradictions in what is known as set theory. It was in that context that he introduced a clever example, framed in ordinary terms, to illustrate one of the major logical difficulties of the era, the Barber paradox. The story speaks of a barber who lives in a town where all men must be clean-shaven. This barber shaves only and precisely those men who do not shave themselves. Straight away, one inevitable question arises: who shaves the barber? At first glance, the situation seems straightforward. If the barber shaves himself, he violates the rule, stating that he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. On the other hand, if he does not shave himself, then he must be shaved by the barber, because he takes care of precisely those men who don't shave themselves. Whichever option you choose, you land in a contradiction. The barber cannot either include himself on his own client list or exclude himself from it without breaking the definition that governs his work. This sort of puzzle did not emerge as a mere pastime. Russell wanted to use a familiar scenario to illustrate a far more profound issue in set theory. The point of that theory was to provide the most fundamental underpinnings of mathematics, defining with precision what a set is and how to group elements without creating contradictions. But at the start of the 20th century, signs of trouble were already looming. Similar to the barber's case, a question arose: could there be a set of all sets that are not members of themselves? Russell found that these self-containing definitions led to paradoxes that could dismantle the logical frameworks people then took for granted. In the Barber paradox, the statement, "the barber shaves all those men who do not shave themselves," acts as a sort of semantic trap, because when the barber tries to apply the criterion to himself, an inconsistency appears. Within set theory, the equivalent was to imagine the collection of all sets that do not include themselves. Asking, does this set include itself, triggered a loop identical to the barber's conundrum. If it does include itself, it violates its own definition. If it does not include itself, then it should do so. For Russell, this clash revealed that one could not build mathematics on a naive conception of all sets, because the notion of a universal set that contains everything, including itself, led to contradiction. This example drove Russell to propose a theory known as the theory of types, aimed at establishing different levels or hierarchies to prevent a set from belonging to itself. Put differently, in that theory, one rules out any relationship between elements and sets that would produce the Barber paradox. Still, the brilliance of the story doesn't lie solely in the details of set theory, but in showing us how our language can produce scenarios that seem logical, yet break down when they're applied to reality. Why do a town, a barber, and a razor illustrate such a logical quandary so effectively? Probably because it wraps an abstract problem in a down-to-earth narrative. Anyone immediately grasps the situation. The barber is given a very clear criterion for who he shaves, but if he applies that criterion to himself, the system collapses. This makes the paradox a highly effective teaching tool, while also highlighting how complicated it can be to encircle everything with closed, self-referential definitions. Since that time, numerous logicians and mathematicians have proposed variations or reinterpretations of this dilemma. While the barber may be just a literary device, it illustrates a vital point about the principle of non-contradiction. You cannot grant a characteristic to an object in a way that depends on the impossibility of granting it in the first place. In mathematics, if we search for a list or set, that follows the rule, "It contains all and only those sets that do not contain themselves," we run into the same paradox we get by asking whether the barber shaves himself or not. Though its narrative is simple, this problem played a significant role in the growth of various logical schools in the ensuing decades. It raised the need to distinguish between object language and meta-language, explored self-reference as a factor in these dead ends, and led to experiments in typing variables so incompatible logical levels wouldn't mix. The paradox is so important that it helped to lay the groundwork for more rigorous approaches to semantics and syntax, both in mathematics and in the philosophy of language. Despite all the debate, the example retains its popularity. Even outside formal circles, the Barber paradox continues to captivate newcomers to the study of logic. It isn't surprising that it elicits a sense of bewilderment. Something as ordinary as a man who shaves his neighbors suddenly becomes a symbol for the frailty of certain seemingly harmless definitions. Perhaps the paradox has no solution in the traditional sense, but it does teach us that when we talk about the totality of something, or about a whole that refers to itself, we can wind up on treacherous ground. In the end, the barber still waits for someone to resolve his predicament, and that might be precisely the point. There's no escape under the terms in which the story is formulated. Instead, there's an invitation to reflect on the limits of language and on the logical conditions that must be met before claiming that a set, a system, or a definition can truly encompass everything, including the person defining it. This humble barber, originally a rhetorical illustration, encourages us to think more carefully about the nature of our frameworks and about the need to avoid categories that simultaneously include and destroy themselves. A paradoxical lesson indeed, yet remarkably fruitful for the history of logic and mathematics. The omnipotence paradox. Often posed in a seemingly simple question, can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? This paradox, despite its apparent simplicity, conceals a philosophical theological puzzle that has sparked centuries of debate among thinkers of various eras and traditions. The initial setup imagines that the being in question possesses omnipotence, meaning it can do anything it wills. If we say it can create a stone so immense that even it cannot lift it, we're admitting that its power falls short in supporting the stone. Hence, it would no longer be truly omnipotent. But if we claim it cannot create such a stone, we also impose a limit on its infinite faculties. Whichever angle you take, you end up facing the conclusion that absolute omnipotence cannot exist in the way we typically conceive it. Historically, this dilemma has been addressed largely from a theological perspective. Medieval thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas grappled with understanding divine omnipotence without lapsing into logical contradiction. For Aquinas, God cannot do things that are contradictory in themselves, like a square circle or an entity that is and is not at the same time. From that perspective, the stone question is a request for a contradiction. One is asking God to create something that escapes his own power, which is itself a logical absurdity. Hence, the scholastic answer is generally that God is omnipotent with respect to anything that does not involve a contradiction. Not all philosophers or theologians agree with this line of thought. Some argue that the idea of absolute omnipotence extends not just to the ability to perform any conceivable action, but to the power to transcend our own laws of logic. In other words, if an omnipotent being is supposed to have created everything, including time, space, and logical norms, then it could nullify or manipulate them at will. From that perspective, the paradox is resolved by asserting that the question itself is built on assumptions that have no validity for a genuinely omnipotent being. However, the paradox is not confined to religious realms alone. It also serves to explore the limits of power and logic. When we translate the question into less theological terms, we might rephrase it as, Are there logical boundaries that not even the greatest possible power could overcome? Some philosophers, such as Alvin Plantinga, distinguish between maximal power and power unrestricted by logical constraints, emphasizing how crucial the internal coherence of the notion of omnipotence really is. If something defies the logical rules of consistency, then it ceases to be a possible thing and thus cannot fall under the scope of potential action, even for an all-powerful entity. In contemporary philosophy, debates about the omnipotence paradox often connect with other logical and metaphysical issues, the existence of evil, human free will, or the possibility of multiple universes. Absolute omnipotence, understood in its strictest sense, collides not only with the problem of the impossible stone, but also with the perennial conflict between omnipotence and benevolence, known as the problem of evil. If a good and omnipotent being exists, why would it allow suffering? Ultimately, the omnipotence paradox invites us to examine the internal coherence of the concept of absolute. What are the boundaries that define possible actions? Can an infinite power contemplate its own negation without undermining its essence? Perhaps the answer is that our language and logic break down when attempting to describe something that, by definition, lies beyond their limits. Or perhaps, following scholastic reasoning, there simply is no power to create impossible contradictions, thus nullifying the paradox when we rigorously reformulate the terms of omnipotence. Either way, the impossible stone, too heavy even for its creator, continues to remind us that the notion of absolute power tests not only the limits of human imagination, but also the consistency of our theories about what exists, what could exist, and what we can conceive without falling into contradiction. Despite the centuries that have passed, the dilemma still stands, reminding us that the ideas of infinity and absoluteness remain among the most challenging and fascinating fields in philosophy. Sorites paradox, the heap paradox. Often referred to simply as the heap paradox, the Sorites paradox challenges how we use vague terms in language. The name Sorites comes from the Greek soros, meaning heap, and its origin is usually attributed to Eubulides of Miletus, an ancient Greek philosopher who also posed several other well-known paradoxes. The basic reasoning is surprisingly simple. If you have a heap of sand and remove a single grain, it seems you still have a heap. If you remove another grain, you'd likely still call it a heap. The trouble arises when this process continues until you're left with just a few grains, or even a single grain. And at some point, it becomes absurd to say that you still have a heap, yet pinpointing the exact moment it ceased to be a heap is extraordinarily difficult. By way of example, imagine you define heap as 10,000 grains of sand. Does it remain a heap if it has 9,999 grains? It's quite likely you'd say yes, because removing just one grain doesn't seem to make a difference. Repeating this reasoning by removing one grain at a time poses a logical hurdle. It's hard to claim you've gone from heap to not a heap by losing a single grain, yet eventually you get down to a small handful or even just one grain, and it's clearly no longer a heap. When did the transition happen? And this dilemma points to a broader problem with vague or imprecise terms in language. Words like bald, tall, poor, or heap don't have sharply defined boundaries. While these terms work acceptably in everyday communication, trying to analyze them with the rigor of classical logic exposes the lack of clear lines. The Sorites paradox lays bare this difficulty. How many grains make a heap? How many grey hairs make someone grey-haired? How many centimeters of height are needed to be called tall? We generally rely on approximate ranges, but there is no exact dividing line that can hold up under logical scrutiny. Over the course of philosophical history, different solutions have been proposed. Some have invoked fuzzy logic, abandoning the binary categories of classical logic, either yes or no, and instead allowing degrees of membership. For instance, a group of grains might be a heap at 100%, a heap at 95%, and so on, progressively decreasing as more grains are removed. This approach does away with the law of the excluded middle found in classical logic, thereby accommodating intermediate truth values. Others endorse supervaluationism, which maintains that it's still valid to use these vague terms as long as there exist clear-cut cases for when the term definitely applies and clear-cut cases for when it definitely does not apply, even if large grey areas lie in between. From this viewpoint, vaguely defined language isn't necessarily contradictory. Rather, we simply acknowledge that exact boundaries can be hard to pinpoint. There is also the epistemicist perspective, which asserts that there really is a precise point where a heap ceases to be a heap, but we don't know or can't practically identify where that point is. According to this viewpoint, exact precision does indeed exist objectively, yet our limited knowledge or the way we use language prevents us from singling out that point. The real power of the Sorites paradox lies in showing how fragile our everyday categories become under intense analytical scrutiny. While everyday logic doesn't need a pinpoint moment to distinguish a heap from a small cluster of grains, philosophy and semantics reveal that lacking strict definitions can lead us to apparent contradictions, or, at the very least, theoretically problematic ambiguities. Nevertheless, for most practical purposes, the inherent vagueness of language allows us to communicate effectively without major issues. Ultimately, the Sorites paradox doesn't bow to a simplistic "that's just how it is" resolution. Instead, it compels us to examine the very nature of language, identity, and the limits of what we consider true in our environment. It directly challenges our assumption that the world can be subdivided into neat, unchanging categories, highlighting that reality often operates in subtle gradations that don't always fit cleanly into rigid definitions. In the end, the paradox reminds us that while our words serve us well in daily life, they are far from infallible tools for describing the world in absolute terms when tested by logical precision. The crocodile paradox. Imagine a reptile that abducts a child and presents the mother with a disturbing ultimatum. It will only return the child if she can predict exactly what it will do. At first glance, this might appear to be a twisted but straightforward challenge. However, the situation becomes extremely convoluted the moment the mother utters a phrase whose very structure throws into question whether the abductor can follow through on its word without falling into contradiction. The crucial point arises when she says, "You will not return my child." Once those words are spoken, the captor is caught in a dilemma if he intends to honor his own rule. If he decides to give the child back, the woman's prediction would be false, which, according to the agreement, should prevent him from returning the child. Yet if he opts not to return the child, then the mother's statement would prove accurate, and he would be obliged, under that same rule, to give the child back. Either choice generates a contradiction that highlights the paradoxical nature of the arrangement. This scenario has often been used to show how language, when describing future actions tied to the truth or falsehood of a related statement, can create a vicious circle that blocks a logical resolution. In this example, the reptile appears bound by its own conditions, while the mother leverages the power of self-reference to devise an argumentative trap. The result is a rational deadlock. No matter what the abductor does, the mother's statement undermines the coherence of the pact. Similar situations appear in other philosophical puzzles. The liar paradox, centered on the sentence, "This statement is false," employs the same principle of an utterance that speaks about its own truth value, upending conventional logical frameworks. The famous unexpected exam, where a teacher announces a surprise test on a day the students won't be expecting, reflects a related dynamic. By trying to deduce the exact day, the students rule out each possibility until concluding there will be no test, only to find themselves caught off guard when the teacher administers the exam anyway. At its core, this dilemma illustrates how a promise hinging on the accuracy of a prediction can lead to a deep contradiction. Some contend that the agreement was flawed from the outset. It's not feasible to promise something contingent on a claim that, by being true or false, alters the very conditions of fulfillment. Others suggest that it is the mother's carefully crafted statement that makes the situation insoluble by exploiting a logical structure meant to force the captor to break his own rules. Still others argue that language is ill-suited for such self-referential declarations aimed at enforcing an unbreakable rule about a future event. In philosophical terms, this predicament invites questions about prediction, free will, and the consistency of our logical constructs. The future isn't always capturable in a proposition, especially if that proposition itself influences how the event plays out. When the destiny of an action depends on whether a statement about it is true or false, the action seems to slip out of the hands of those making or receiving the statement. This sparks discussions about whether absolute determinism is possible, or if claims to total control over outcomes collapse in scenarios of self-reference. Though the notion of a child-snatching reptile may appear fantastical, this tale has captivated those studying logic and the philosophy of language because it illustrates how words and intended actions can negate each other. The exchange challenges the idea that language can neatly pin down every situation and underscores the difficulty of establishing flawless rules when individuals retain the freedom to change their behavior based on what is said or believed will happen. As with so many classic paradoxes, there is no definitive solution that satisfies every perspective. Rather, these puzzles are valuable because they shake our certainties about how reality operates and how language portrays it. The crocodile, the mother, her statement, and the resulting outcome form a mixture of logic and trickery that reveals it is not enough to simply declare clear rules to avoid inconsistencies. It is precisely in the details of interaction, in the freedom to act, and in the interpretation of language that the seed of contradiction takes root. Ultimately, such paradoxes lay bare the limitations of reason when confronted with utterances whose validity feeds back on itself and leads to a logical impasse of the raven paradox, Hempel. Imagine we want to test the universal hypothesis. All ravens are black. At first, it would seem logical to look for ravens and check whether each one indeed has black plumage. However, the philosopher and logician Carl Gustav Hempel noted a peculiar consequence in the methods of induction used to confirm a hypothesis, resulting in what is now known as the raven paradox. Let's start with the logical form of the hypothesis. All ravens are black can be rephrased as, if something is a raven, then it is black. This statement resembles a proposition of the form, if P then Q. In classical logic and in inductive methodology, it is assumed that observing cases confirming P-Q provides evidence in favor of the hypothesis. For example, observing a black raven is taken as yet another instance that confirms the general rule. The surprise arises when, by applying a logical derivation, one sees that the statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to all non-black things are non-ravens. This contraposition, if not black, then not a raven, leads to an apparently absurd conclusion. Under the same criteria of confirmation, finding a red object, like an apple, that is not a raven should also count as evidence supporting the claim that all ravens are black. This follows from the logical equivalence. Every instance of not black that also turns out to be not a raven seems to support the hypothesis that, if it were a raven, it would be black. This result is jarring to our scientific intuition. Ordinarily, no one would consider that observing a red apple or a blue pen confirms that all ravens have black plumage. We would expect that, to reinforce the hypothesis, one should observe actual ravens and verify their color. Yet, if we accept the principle of extensionality underlying formal logic, the equivalence between all ravens are black and all non-black things are non-ravens, we must concede that each object not black and not a raven provides confirmation of the general hypothesis. The paradox caught the attention of the philosophical community because it shows a clash between our common sense and the formal rules of confirmation. Intuitively, we see that finding one more black raven genuinely bolsters the statement all ravens are black, while observing some random object of a different color and seeing it is not a raven feels irrelevant to the question. From a strictly logical viewpoint, however, both discoveries appear to carry the same weight. The raven paradox relates to broader debates about induction, the problem of confirmation, and what is often called the logic of hypotheses. Hempel devised it to demonstrate how a methodological principle, whereby confirming positive instances of a generalization supports that generalization, can lead to counterintuitive consequences. Observing 1,000 black ravens seems more meaningful than looking at just any red object and confirming it's not a raven, yet formal confirmation theory does not initially distinguish between these findings. Various philosophers and logicians have proposed interpretations aimed at mitigating or explaining the paradox. One approach appeals to the idea that not all observations carry the same epistemic weight. In practice, discovering that another non-black item is not a raven does not really supply new information, because the world is full of non-raven objects. Empirically speaking, the act of finding a raven and verifying its color proves far more decisive for the hypothesis. From this perspective, accumulating an infinite number of non-raven objects, like chairs, stones, or multicolored fruit, may provide formal confirmation, yet contributes virtually no additional insight. Another viewpoint suggests that the paradox arises from applying logical equivalence in a context of induction. In pure logic, PQ is synonymous with Q. However, when it comes to empirical confirmation, the evidential impact is not distributed uniformly between these two statements. Put differently, logical equivalence does not necessarily entail equivalent confirmatory value in scientific practice. This points to the notion that confirmation cannot be reduced to mere formal equivalence among logically identical statements. Others underscore the importance of theoretical background. Observing a black raven is more relevant if our hypothesis specifically addresses the class of objects called ravens. On the other hand, observing a yellow vase that is not a raven may yield little information because we're not examining a member of the class we seek to confirm or refute. For many, the paradox proves that scientific confirmation cannot be reduced to purely formal logic alone. It also involves pragmatic factors like informational value, the likelihood of encountering counterexamples, and other contextual elements. Finally, the raven paradox ties into broader epistemological problems such as David Hume's problem of induction or Karl Popper's principle of falsifiability. All these discussions highlight that our inductive reasoning and scientific expectations do not always align neatly with the standards of pure logic, yet they remain indispensable for developing knowledge. In the end, Hempel's proposal confronts us with a contradiction between formal logic and intuition when it comes to confirming universal hypotheses. Seeing that a raven is black undoubtedly feels like direct, genuine evidence for all ravens are black, yet finding any random non-black object that is not a raven, strangely enough, also works as confirmation under a strictly logical lens. This apparent inconsistency prompts us to consider how we define evidentiary weight, reminding us that scientific methodology cannot be reduced to a purely formal system, and that the practice of empirical observation is guided by principles that sometimes exceed the bounds of classical logic. Thus, the raven paradox remains a topic of debate in the philosophy of science and epistemology, reminding us of the complexity in reconciling how we think about reality with the formal tools we employ to describe it. The paradox of choice, or overload of options. In everyday life, we often assume that having more alternatives is a good thing. It increases our freedom of choice and helps us find the best possible option. However, what is called the paradox of choice, also known as the overload of options, reveals that an excess of possibilities can actually lead to confusion, decision paralysis, and reduced satisfaction with the choices we make. This phenomenon has been widely discussed in fields such as psychology, behavioral economics, and sociology, raising questions about the relationship between having abundant choices and our personal well-being. The term became popular largely through the work of psychologist Barry Schwartz, author of The Paradox of Choice: Why More is Less. Schwartz described how the proliferation of alternatives, whether in buying products, choosing a career path, or planning our daily lives, could be overwhelming. Rather than making us feel freer, the surplus of options often leads to mental fatigue and perpetual uncertainty about whether we made the right decision. To illustrate, imagine you're looking for a new pair of shoes. If there were only 2 or 3 models available, comparison would be simple, and you could decide quickly. By contrast, if you enter a store filled with dozens of styles, colors, prices, and brands, choosing becomes far more complicated. You spend extra time comparing, get lost in the details, and in the end feel dissatisfied, wondering if there was a better alternative you failed to properly assess. This effect has been studied in contexts ranging from supermarkets and health plans to financial investments and even streaming platforms, where an abundance of choices, movies, series, music, can lead to what is known as decision fatigue, the struggle to continue making optimal choices after being faced with too many decisions in a row. It's as though your brain gets saturated and you lose the mental energy or motivation required to thoroughly weigh each alternative. To better understand the root of this paradox, several psychological mechanisms have been proposed. Fear of regret. The more options available, the greater the likelihood that there's another choice that might have been better. Even if we can't really test that theory, the mere idea of missing out on something causes remorse. This problem worsens in shopping or subscription systems that let us see everything we aren't choosing, such as infinite online catalogs or constant price comparisons. Raised expectations. As variety grows, so does the expectation of finding the one perfect option that matches all our preferences. In practice, no option usually meets every expectation, leading to a stronger feeling of disappointment than if we had fewer possibilities. Perfectionism is exacerbated by the belief that, given the vast number of choices, there must be an ideal solution out there. Mental cost of decision-making. Every time we evaluate multiple options, we spend time and cognitive resources analyzing, comparing, and discarding them. As choices multiply, this task can become exhausting. The human brain isn't equipped to efficiently compare so many variables or weigh all consequences, and eventually the overload results in either a freeze or an impulsive decision. Maximizers versus satisficers. A key concept in the paradox of choice is the distinction between maximizers, those who try to find the absolute, objectively superior option in every decision, and satisficers, those who are content with something that meets a minimum threshold of acceptability. Studies show that maximizers experience more stress and regret when confronted with an overwhelming range of options, since they feel compelled to locate the best among too many alternatives. Satisficers, on the other hand, adapt more easily and end up more satisfied when they find something good enough, rather than chasing perfection. The paradox of choice doesn't mean we must restrict all our freedoms or live with a minimal set of possibilities. Rather, the challenge lies in balancing the convenience of having multiple options, which in principle facilitates customization and flexibility, with the realization that too many choices can become a source of distress and psychological fatigue. Many companies and user-experienced UX designers have started to think about how to simplify the presentation of products and services, whether through personalized suggestions, grouping, or filters that help reduce the number of relevant alternatives. In politics and society, the paradox can also be seen in systems such as health plans, pension funds, or voting processes that offer too many alternatives. Sometimes, people end up not participating, postponing their choice, or choosing at random in the face of such complexity. This shows that an abundance of options does not necessarily boost civic engagement or improve the quality of decisions. A clear example of this paradox is in personal relationships and dating in the digital age, where apps and social media present infinite possibilities for meeting new people. For some, this abundance leads to less willingness to commit and a constant quest for something better that may just be one click away, resulting in cycles of dissatisfaction and doubt. Research has shown in various experiments that offering fewer choices can lead to both higher sales and greater customer satisfaction. One classic study involves jam tastings. A stall with 24 different flavors attracts a lot of initial attention, but few final purchases, whereas one with only 6 flavors ends up making more sales and leaving customers more satisfied. The reasoning is that fewer options make people more comfortable with their decisions and reduce the perceived risk of being wrong. That said, some authors clarify that the paradox of choice doesn't operate identically across all cultures, personalities, or circumstances. Certain individuals truly enjoy diving into hundreds of alternatives without showing signs of decision fatigue, while others feel overwhelmed even with a handful of options. Thus, there are personal and contextual differences that can shape how strongly we experience the overload of choice. Either way, the greatest contribution of the paradox of choice is its reminder that absolute freedom of choice does not automatically equate to greater well-being or increased happiness. Sometimes a manageable degree of limitation or tools that offer clear guidance can relieve the mental burden and allow us to make decisions more calmly. In this sense, identifying the sweet spot between too many and too few options can help us manage the complexity of our environment without succumbing to paralysis or frustration. In short, the paradox of choice highlights how having a huge variety of options can, instead of expanding our sense of fulfillment and control, trigger anxiety, difficulty committing, and lingering dissatisfaction about whether or not we chose well. In a society increasingly saturated with information and offers, it's crucial to think about which strategies help us handle decision-making effectively without undermining our well-being. Ultimately, the key is to strike an intelligent balance. The diversity of options is valuable and enriching, yet too much of it can silently undermine our satisfaction and plunge us into endless doubts about what could have been. The prisoner's dilemma paradox from game theory. The prisoner's dilemma stands as one of the most emblematic and foundational problems in modern game theory. It emerged in the 1950s thanks to the work of mathematician Merrill Flood and psychologist Melvin Drescher, but it was Albert W. Tucker who popularized the version that has persisted to this day. Picture 2 suspects, A and B, apprehended for a crime and held in separate cells. They cannot communicate with each other, and the police offer each one a separate deal without the other knowing exactly what is being negotiated. Each prisoner has 2 possible moves: remain silent, cooperate with their partner, or inform, betray. The sentence they receive depends on the combination of decisions. If both remain silent, the police lack definitive evidence, and each prisoner gets a moderate sentence, for example 1 year in prison. If one betrays and the other remains silent, the betrayer goes free, 0 years, while the one who stays silent is handed the maximum sentence, let's say 3 years. Finally, if both decide to betray, the police then have enough evidence to convict them, but each prisoner's cooperation leads to a partial sentence reduction, leaving each with 2 years. The paradox arises when we notice that, from a collective point of view, it would be better for both to remain silent in order to minimize the total penalty combined, 1 year plus 1 year, for a total of 2. However, from an individual perspective, each one fears that the other might betray, which would leave the silent party facing the harshest sentence. Consequently, the rational strategy for each prisoner, in trying to minimize their own jail time without knowing what the other will do, is to betray. This self-interested choice coincides with what game theory calls a Nash equilibrium. Neither player has an incentive to unilaterally change their strategy, even though the end result, both betraying and getting 2 years each, is worse than mutual cooperation. It is considered a paradox because it illustrates the tension between what benefits the individual and what benefits the group. Independently rational behavior in pursuit of maximum personal gain leads to an outcome worse than mutual collaboration. For that reason, the prisoner's dilemma has become a touchstone for analyzing cooperation and competition in myriad contexts. In economics, for example, it clarifies price wars between companies or the tendency to produce more than is socially optimal in the absence of regulations. In international politics, it helps to understand arms races, where each country considers it rational to build up arms despite the collective increase in risk. In evolutionary biology, it explains how cooperation can appear between organisms in situations such as forming societies or engaging in reciprocal altruism. The prisoner's dilemma can be enriched with variations that deepen its analytical value. One of the best known is the iterated prisoner's dilemma, in which players confront each other repeatedly and remember the other player's past actions. This approach reveals the importance of strategies like tit for tat, do unto the other as they have done unto you, or forgive and punish, which show how cooperation can emerge from the possibility of retaliation and reconciliation. There is also a multiplayer variant in which more than 2 participants face the same dilemma, cooperate or betray, though the complexity rises as the number of players increases. In practice, the dilemma poses a challenge of designing mechanisms or rules to foster cooperation. Numerous social and political systems aim to impose sanctions or set incentives so that the remain silent, cooperate strategy becomes more appealing than the temptation to betray everyone else. Laws, international treaties, market regulations, and even cultural or moral norms can be seen as efforts to adjust the payoff matrix so that cooperation no longer seems naive, instead becoming the best option for each individual. Nonetheless, in the simplest and purest scenario, where there is no communication or credible external punishment, the dominant outcome, from a game theory perspective, will be mutual betrayal. Here lies the core point. It is not due to any error by the prisoners, but rather a logical consequence of the incentive structure, where each one reasons that, whether or not the other betrays, it is always better to do so himself. Formally coherent, this result demonstrates that the sum of individual interests can yield a globally suboptimal outcome. The prisoner's dilemma has attained a prominent position in the history of thought by showing that individual rationality, absent any additional coordination or commitment mechanism, does not necessarily produce the best collective solution. Its paradoxical quality does not imply a logical absurdity, but rather points to the finding that the pursuit of the best private choice can conflict with overall social welfare. The paradox goes further still. If the game is allowed to repeat indefinitely, cooperation can emerge as a stable strategy, but only under certain assumptions, uncertainty about when interactions end, reputation mechanisms, and so on. Hence, the dilemma shifts from a mere hypothetical exercise to a model that shapes core questions of social conduct and governance, from neighborly harmony to peace among nations. In short, the prisoner's dilemma vividly illustrates the clash between what serves the individual in the short term and what would be preferable for the group in the long run. Without additional mechanisms, logic leads to a Nash equilibrium of mutual betrayal. However, the possibility of creating incentives, setting rules of the game, and introducing modes of communication can alter this perspective, making it feasible to explore how cooperation arises, persists, and collapses in human society. Indeed, it remains one of the most engaging debates within game theory, economics, sociology, politics, and many other fields.